So what we're going to talk about today is starting to take our images from Lightroom, which we've been working on for the last part of the term, and everything that we've done so far has been non-destructive. So what we want to be able to do today is to start to take those photos and move them into Photoshop. And Photoshop and Lightroom are made to kind of work together. And so we want to continue our workflow in a way that's going to be non-destructive. So let's go ahead and jump right into Lightroom. And what I've done is I've grabbed two photos. And one of the earliest ways that we started to work with combining pictures in back when we were doing things with film was working with adding clouds to the sky, because one of the things with old film, it didn't have very good um, kind of overexposed in the skies, and so oftentimes photographers would later print back in clouds from a different exposure, a different sheet of film. So we've got these two pictures. One was taken in Utah, and then the other one was taken in Oceanside about a week or so later. So in order to open these two photos, what we're going to do is I'm going to use the Shift key and select both of them. And then I'm just going to right click. So on my trackpad, I'm just tapping with two fingers, and that brings up the right click menu. It could also be done with the Control key. And I'm going to go into Edit In. Now, that'll help connect Lightroom and Photoshop, but there's a couple of ways we could do it. And so the kind of most obvious one would be edit inside of Photoshop, but there's a better choice for us. So we're going to go down here to this one. It says Open as a Smart Object in Photoshop. So I'll go ahead and click there. The thing about smart objects is what they do is they're basically kind of like taking a suitcase of the information that's in this file. And one of these files is a raw file, so I don't want to lose that ability to kind of work from that raw file. So it's going to go ahead and take that and it's going to send it over, and there'll be a slightly different icon once we get over here inside of Photoshop. So notice in Photoshop we've got this little icon at the bottom right hand corner of my layer thumbnail, and it's indicating that this is a smart object. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to start with the image of the landscape, of the rock. And the reason I chose this one is the edges are really kind of complicated, and also trees are really difficult, kind of like hair, to make a good selection. And so I'm actually going to use a method which is a very early method as far as Photoshop goes. Instead of using something like select subject, I'm going to use a very kind of straightforward method of using channels to make a selection. So once we have this file inside of Photoshop, I'm going to go over here and switch from layers and into channels. And so notice there's four layers here, one being the RGB, which is everything combined, and then there's a red, green, and a blue layer. So I'm going to go ahead and turn off all the layers except for my layer of blue, because the sky is blue, and what I want to get rid of is blue, and so that's going to have the strongest density. So notice this gives me a pretty good white. There's some value and some density up in here, and also especially up in the trees. Now, I don't want to actually work on this layer because that's going to actually, or that channel, it's going to cause problems if I do that. So what I'm going to do is duplicate it by simply dragging it down here to the new layer icon, and that'll create a copy of that blue layer. And I'm going to go ahead and hit Command L and create a layers adjustment. So what I want to do is actually try to increase that difference, because what I'm going to do is eventually turn this into a layer mask, which is a great non-destructive way to go ahead and work with our file. So in order to do that, what we need to do is actually increase the contrast. Basically, I want everything down in this area to be black, and I want everything in the sky area to be white. And I want to maintain some of the detail, obviously, in these little areas of the tree. That's where the selection is going to be really hard. So I'm going to start by bringing down the whites, which is going to actually make them brighter. I'm also going to bring up the blacks. That'll make that blacker. And I'm keeping a close eye down in this area so that I don't lose too much detail in those little areas of the white tree part. There's some other steps that we can take later that are going to help increase that. You can also kind of darken down these midtones as well. That'll help bring down a lot of the value in those areas, which might mean I need to also kind of back again, increase that white a little bit. And so we're trying to make what's pretty close to a good selection. Looks like I'm losing a little bit of detail down in that bottom tree area, so I want to bring back some of that. There we go. So I maintain some of those branches and things down in that bottom corner. Now, it's looking pretty good, but if I turn that into a selection right now, any of those middle values are going to start to lose some of their detail. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and hit OK there. And one of the methods we would do in the darkroom is if I needed something lighter or darker, I'd use burn and dodge. So I'm going to go ahead and use the burn and dodge tool here. So what I want to do is darken some of these values that I want to go black so that I get a nice selection in there. So I'm going to go ahead and go into the burn tool, which is indicated by the hand because that's where we would let light through and start to expose the paper. And I'm going to increase my brush size a little bit by using the bracket keys here. And because I'm doing the burn tool, I want to affect the shadows more than the highlights. So what's really cool is when I come in here and I start to adjust, it doesn't really matter if I go right, a perfect painting job because it can't affect that white area, right? Because it's only affecting my shadows. So I'm going to go in here and as much as I can, start to darken down those areas that I really want to actually be black. Because when I create that layer mask, black is going to allow me, it's going to hide that area, and then the white areas are going to show it, and eventually we'll end up inverting that so that we lose the sky and maintain our landscape. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. Now I'm getting a pretty solid black through most of those. There's also some areas where it's not quite going white, so what I'm going to do is actually reverse this, and I'm going to dodge, so it's going to actually block the light from hitting those areas. And I want to work on, again, the highlights. I'm going to, again, increase my my exposure a little bit, as last time it was around 50%. And so now I'm going to also start to do the painting, but this time I'm going to do the paints inside of the white area. So when I do that, it just brightens up those whites, again, right along that kind of horizon line so that it frees up. And if I make a mistake and I go in here, there's no highlights there, so nothing really happens. And so again, I'm just going to kind of clean that up. That'll brighten up those areas, those little bits of contrast, especially like in this little tree area. I want to get rid of as much of that halo of that blue that was kind of lingering as I can. Okay, so now I've got a really nice high contrast black and white mask, basically, that's been created in that layer channel. So in order to turn that into a selection, which I can then use, I'm going to go ahead and click here on the Make Into a Selection. So now I've got marching ants. And so you can see here, the marching ants are creating a selection. The selection is going to tell Photoshop, I want to use this area of the picture and not anything on the outside of that. So with those marching ants, I'm going to go ahead and turn off this layer and go back to my regular RGB file. And I want to make sure that that's the active layer. Because now what I want to start to do is work with those pixels. And because I've got my selection turned on, I'm going to go ahead and move over into layers instead of inside of channels. And what I want to do is I want to create a layer mask. So layer mask is this really powerful way to work with non-destructive editing. So in order to create that layer mask, there's an icon down here, which is a new layer mask. And there's several ways we could go about doing it. If I just go ahead and click it, because my active area is the sky, what I'm going to end up with is the sky. So I'm going to go ahead and hit Command Z just so I can go back for a second. Now, if I hold the Option key instead, it will invert that image or that mask as it goes to do it. So I could go ahead and click there holding the Option key. Now I have a mask of the actual image itself. And we can see, once we get in there, that it made a really good selection, going through, in the tree areas and along this ridge line. So now that I've got this mask, I can go ahead and I wanted to do it to this picture first before I moved it over, so that if I ever decide I want to do something different with this, I've already taken the time to create the really good selection, so I don't have to go and do that again, because this is a smart object. Now, I'm going to move this file into my sky file. So in order to do that, to preserve the layer mask, I'm going to go ahead and hold the Shift key and click on the actual layer mask over here. That then gives me back my picture the way that it was. And I want to move it into that other picture. So I'm going to hit V on the keyboard, or I could go up here to the top and select the Move tool. And I'm going to drag this directly over to my sky. And then I'm going to drag it down and release. And it will drop it basically in that picture. Now, the aspect ratios of these two photos that are shot with different cameras aren't going to match. So that's okay. In order to change the scale of it, I'm going to hit Command T. Now, one of the really great things about using a smart object is it's rescalable. So because it doesn't actually bring over pixels into the picture, as I scale up or down, it's not going to do anything to lose that original information. So using the Shift key, I'm going to go ahead and click and drag down. In the newest version of Photoshop, Photoshop 18, the new version doesn't actually require that you use the Shift key. So but I'm still working. These computers haven't been updated yet. So I'm just going to go ahead and use the Shift key so it stays proportional. I'm going to reframe this up the way that I want it and double click. So now I've applied that transformation. Now it brought over my layer mask with it, so I'm going to go ahead and hit the Shift key, turn that off, and now I've got the skies in the background. And if I want to adjust where that is, I'm just going to go ahead and hit Command T to the sky as well. That way I could adjust a little bit as well. So again, Command T. And I'm just going to drag this up a little bit so that that highlight, or that bright part of the sky is directly behind my sky. And so I'll just drag that down and double click. So now I've got those two together. The last thing I'm going to do kind of quickly is there's a little bit of halo still in there if we're looking in this area here. So I'm just going to do a quick kind of a hue saturation to kind of drop that down a little bit. So I'm going to go in here to hue saturation, and within the hue saturations, I'm going to go ahead and use the blues and the cyans. So I'm going to go to cyan first because the sky has a lot of that cyan, and I'm just going to drop the saturation, just a little bit of those, and make them just a little bit darker. And then I'm going to do the same thing to the blues. I'm going to drop down that blue saturation. And notice right now it's doing it to everything, but I'm going to go ahead and clip this so that it's only affecting that first channel. And so what we should see is if we look inside, one thing here. Let's move this up above our rock and do our clipping mask. And so what we should see is that blue that's kind of in this area of the sky is just going to kind of get dropped down so that it blends together a little bit more seamlessly. Okay. Now, there's a lot of things that we can continue to do working with the photo, stylizing and colorizing, but now we've managed to get those two files in together, and they're done in a non-destructive way. So in order to finish this out, all I need to do is just go ahead and close the file. It's going to ask me, do I want to save? It's already created a new file, Sky1, so I'm just going to go ahead and say save. And then also, on this one, because I want to be able to come back in case I want this file for another time and move it to somewhere else, I'm going to go ahead and also tell it to save. So when I get back inside of Lightroom, I should have 4 images. One is my image that's going to be combined, and then the others are the originals, and then this is the one that has my layer mask on it as well. And again, that's indicated by the dash edit. All right, so that's the basics of how we can bring those together. There's a lot more we can do to start to work once we've got those files inside of Photoshop.